Hello and welcome to this AIM North America webinar on unique device identification. Our expert panel will explain how UDI has gone global, a discussion of requirements, challenges, and opportunities. Before I introduce the panelists and we get started, there are a few housekeeping slides I will go over. First is our antitrust policy. It's the policy of AIM North America to conduct its operations in strict compliance with the antitrust laws. No AIM activity shall create even the appearance of a violation of the letter or spirit of the antitrust laws. Next is our collaboration and work product policy. AIM North America committee meetings and presentations like today are held for the primary purpose of advancements in our industry, which necessarily involves development of work product intended solely for the public domain. AIM has developed this policy for the protection of its members who engage in this important collaborative effort. Some other notes: you are muted throughout the presentation. You can join the discussion, however, by sending questions via the Q&A option at the bottom of the webinar application. We'll answer as many questions as time permits at the end of the call. Now I would like to introduce you to today's presenters. Artie Batman-Gelich, the president of Innovatum; Pete Alvarez, senior director of identification and master data at GS1's global office; and Terry Reid, the Director of Partner Relations for Symmetric Health Solutions. Pete Alvarez will be leading off the discussion today. Pete, take it away.
Thank you very much, Mike. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you and the entire team today. Hope you can hear me okay. I am part of the GS1 Global Office team, and I work with the healthcare sector. My areas of responsibilities are AIDC in GS1 standards, that is, and master data standards. I guess to begin with, we should start here. What is a UDI system for those that may not know? Every UDI regulation has three basic components. You have the device identifier and the production identifier shown on the box second from the left. Then all the way to the right, you have the AIDC capture, the barcode that these identifiers can be encoded in. And in the center, you usually have some form of a database that's operated by the regulator, in which all of the records for the devices that are sold in that jurisdiction, a country or region, in the case of the EU, are stored. And on the bottom, you see how these things refer to the GS1 system of standards. So the UDI, the device identifiers and production identifiers, equivalent to what we call identify. On the right is capture, which is our barcoding and RFID standards. And then in the middle is share, which is something you would use one of the technology companies, or perhaps a GDSN data pool. Then on the left-hand side, with the European Union, you have something called Basic UDI DI, which is unique to Europe. And it is used across the UDIMED series of modules that they have in the UDIMED platform to group device identifiers, GTINs in our world, that are part of the same family. So let's get a little deeper and dive into that a bit. So here we do a deeper dive, and if you've been at GS1 conferences or any other conference we present, you've probably seen this slide before, but it does a good job of comparing the UDI components in terminology to the world of GS1 standards. And so again, in Europe, you have the basic UDI DI requirement, and in GS1 standards, we created this global model number a couple of years ago specifically for that purpose. So that's unique to Europe. But then below that, you have the device identifiers on the left, which is the global trade item number for us on the right. Then you have the production identifiers in that world. Those are the application identifiers, such as expiration date, batch, serial number, manufacturer date in certain cases. And so this makes up the entire system. You see the series of acronyms on the left: UDI, DI, plus the PI equals the UDI. I don't know any other job where you can actually say an entire sentence in acronyms, but here we are. And on the right-hand side, you have the GTIN and the application identifiers. The last note on this is that the HRI format shall follow the rules of the issuing agency, issuing entity in our case. And so there you have the comparison. Now, this gets into the next slide, which is how do regulators and how do regulations become more harmonized, and how does that work? Well, fortunately, a long time ago, medical device regulators created this group called the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, and it's a forum in which they participate. At the bottom of the slide, you see the flags of the various countries. You see Canada, US, other parts of the planet, China, so forth. And regulators of medical devices of that industry collaborate. They try to harmonize terminology and try to harmonize approach to the regulations to the degree that is possible for them. And also WHO participates as an observer. And while most regulators do a good job of trying to harmonize at what's considered the global level of the harmonization, we've seen that every regulation also has local requirements. So if you're in the US with the FDA Good ID, you compare that against China or against the EU, for instance, you would see that there's differences between some of the local requirements and that are unique to each jurisdiction. And that's what makes it a little bit challenging for the manufacturer. So let's go to the next slide. And so in the area of product identification and marking then, and so as an issuing agency or issuing entity, whatever the terminology is, whether you're in Europe or the US, we as GS1 staff are not permitted, for instance, to interpret the regulation that must be done by the manufacturers manufacturing the product and selling it in that jurisdiction. And so what we say is we can help you understand how to use GS1 standards to comply with the regulations. So the first point is make sure that you, if you're a manufacturer, if you're a solution provider for a manufacturer, you understand the requirements of that particular regulation, the jurisdiction in question. So if you're in the US or Saudi Arabia, whatever it happens to be. And then it gets to the next point, which is, does that regulation allow you to put all of the identifiers, the production identifiers and device identifiers in one barcode? And if so, then what we have heard in certain cases is this can lead to space constraint issues. So if you're using, for instance, as you'll see in a minute, a GS1 128 barcode, for instance, and you're trying to encode the G10 batch, expiration, and serial, then that can be a barcode of a particular size that may be too large for certain space constraints, depending on the size of the product or case or package that you're putting it on. Which gets us to the next point, which is, well, there are two options. You can use 128 or data matrix, but in certain cases where the manufacturer intends to use 128 for whatever reasons, maybe it's general distribution scanning also, whatever, does the regulation allow you to split the device identifier from the production identifier? So these are things that we would say you need to understand the particular jurisdiction in question. And you can see, for example, and again, this image and the one and the other slide coming up are ones we use often because they do a good job. They're pretty clear about showing both options. This is a Medtronic product and their label, and you can see where they've used it just on 128 barcode, and they have the G10 encoded, and also they have the application identifiers for the batch, lot, expiry, and serial number in the one barcode. And if you look at this label, it has two barcodes, more than likely because it may be a label that is applied in the corner of a pack, I'm imagining. So there's a 128 example. Go to the next slide. And there's an example from B. Brown in this case. Again, another example we use often. There are many, but this one shows it's a good example of how a GS1 data matrix barcode is used to encode the same set of identifiers in a 2D barcode. And so we always try to stress to the manufacturer that understand the requirements, understand the rules of the issuing agency or entity that you're using, and make sure that the barcode they're using is fit for purpose. And so this gets me into my last slide. And so while we always start talking about identification and barcoding, from everything that we have heard from manufacturers who've been doing this for a long time, the identification and barcoding part is not really the harder part. The harder part deals with data management, and various examples on the slide here. For instance, as a manufacturer, is all of your data in one place? Do you know where it is? If you are a small organization, a small company, then more than likely you may have it in one system, an ERP or some other data catalog you may have created. But if you are a type of company that you have multiple divisions in one country or multiple operations all over the world, then more than likely your data is in a bunch of different places. And so that's the first question: where is your data? Do you know where it is? And then closely related to that, the second question is it in a format? Is it in a structured format that allows you to take it and then put it in the format that the particular regulator for that jurisdiction requires. So whether you're preparing data for the good ID, or you've done some of the testing that went on in China, or with UDIMED, can you put it in that format? Do you have it in that structure that you can easily, or easily is a relative term here, but you can put it in the intended format for the intended purpose? This next point is an interesting one, is that because we always assume that, hey, if you're the manufacturer of a product, then you probably have all the data inside your organization. That's not always the case. You may be partnering with a technology company for some reason to help you in the storing or structuring of your data. And so is that the case? Then you need to include them obviously in your policies that you would create internally, and your preparation of data and registration of that entity, particularly in the good ID in this case. This next point is an interesting one. I think this fourth bullet really is connected to the first one in all reality, is that not all source data may be in a discrete field and discrete system. So I said earlier, do you know where your data is? And once you find where it is, then it may not all be in a discrete field. You may need to do some work with your platform infrastructure, whatever you're using. And I'm going to use close with this last point. Is I think this is probably one of the most important things we've heard from manufacturers about making sure, as I like to say, your data is fit for purpose, fit for the intended purpose. Understand the data requirements of the database in which you're trying to store that data in that UDI database. Understand if there are validation rules or prerequisite requirements, and then build those into your internal company policies at the point where you're creating the data. So have the policy and procedures that reflect where the data is going to end up. Because if you do that, there's a higher probability that it'll be fit for purpose. That'll be in the format that they expect from you. Things as simple as, is the GTIN constructed properly? Does it have the right check digit? Are you using the right company prefix? And all of these things come into play when you're landing on this last place here, which is really where you start from a data management perspective. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Pete. Appreciate your insights. And Artie, you will be continuing the conversation. If you just want to tell the audience again a little bit more about yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mike. Artie Batman-Gelich, CEO and President of Innovatum. For the last 20 or so years, I've been working with manufacturers in the area of master data management and enterprise labeling. I had the pleasure of working with Terry and Indira and others at the FDA during the early stages of the Good ID and UDI compliance. And right now I'm working with MedTech Europe as a member of the working group for machine-to-machine communication for UDIMED. So it seems that regulatory compliance and data management has become part of my life. I wanted to thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to attend this meeting. It's not an accident that my slides and my presentation takes off where Pete ended, because data quality and maintaining synchronization across the multiple platforms in enterprises has been a huge challenge for manufacturers, and it has become significantly more arduous with all of these different jurisdictions that now have data demands. And as Pete was saying, data is not all in one places, and we have this mantra in our industry for the single source of truth, and it's somewhat utopian. I think the truth of each data element may exist in multiple places, and the challenge is to maintain it in one location and have it cascade to the other systems and capabilities that require access to that data. This slide somewhat represents the truth that we see in industry, where there are ERP systems, PLM systems. Unfortunately, there's extensive use of Excel for managing regulatory and critical data. We always advocate minimizing that to the extent possible. And even for UDI compliance, I don't know if you all remember it, but the 510K, for example, was a data element that really was not kept in any system, and it became required by the Good ID. So there was a huge effort to go back to old paper files and extract all of that data. So we are seeing a proliferation of that kind of activity and synchronization systems to pull data from various places and share it. And a centralized master data system has emerged as an absolute requirement. It's not necessarily where the data is initiated, but it needs to end up there. And at that point, that data needs to be harvested and communicated out to the various regulatory organizations that have a need for that data. So this is a huge simplification of what we face. And each of these circles represent one of the regulatory organizations that needs data from, let's say, the manufacturers. Of course, that sweet spot is where the star is in the middle. And I have to credit IMDRF and the great work that they have done in order to try and reach some harmonization. So that central sweet spot of that Venn diagram is where all of the jurisdictions have the data that we have data for all of those jurisdictions. Now, Saudi Arabia was not part of IMDRF, but a lot of jurisdictions are agreeing with the terms of the IMDRF in as much as they can. Of course, each of the local requirements and politics and policies indicates that there are going to be data elements that are specific to one or more jurisdictions. So it really does become a big challenge to keep the data and to track it and provide it to the various organizations as they need it. The next slide represents really the good scenario in terms of a data element that is available and needs to be used by the multiple jurisdictions. A technology challenge is that when you, from a machine-to-machine communication perspective, or even exporting to an Excel to give it to a third party, the organizations and the jurisdictions need that data in different formats. So you may have a single-use data element, but one jurisdiction wants to see it as a yes or no, another one as 0 or 1, true or false, or even a numeric code. So the way that that ideally should work is you should keep that data as a single data element that makes sense to your internal organization, and then transform that in some technology manner to the way that the jurisdictions need to see it. And the next slide will represent one form of this. So you may have your single-use data element coming from your PLM system, it could come from your ERP system, or it could be housed in the master data. But however it is inputted into the organization, it needs to reside in the master data from which a technology data element, a module, pulls that data and transforms it to the way that each of your regulatory data partners require it. And the technology that we often use and recommend is the concept of a plugin, where the plugin simply takes the data as it's provided, does all of the transformation, has all of the encryption logic, has all of the communication logic, and then it can send it out. And as the requirements grow and Australia comes online and China sets up machine-to-machine communication, Korea and others, Saudi Arabia, then you don't have to revalidate the entire system. You simply use the plugin architecture to insert a new set of capabilities. In order to be able to do that, the next slide represents a very robust prototype or concept around a master data system. It needs to be fully configurable. You need to be able to segregate data and organize data. It needs to be able to add tabs and data elements and policies, enforcement. Let's say the GTIN has to be 14 characters. It can't be less, it can't be more. Calculates the GTIN. You cannot reuse that GTIN for other items. So there's a lot of data integrity concepts that Pete spoke about that need to be enforced at the source of the data. Additionally, when you have tens or hundreds of thousands of data elements, SKUs in your system, there is a need for a very robust methodology to access that data, to find exactly what you want, and then to be able to take action upon it, right? So what is represented in this case is a Brexit nightmare that is faced by many, many companies, where because of the exit from Europe, BSI is no longer able, BSI UK is no longer able to be a notified body. So this has caused all kinds of impact in terms of modifying your CE marks, changing all of your labels, etc. And to have a system that allows you to version current data, make mass updates, generate mass labels, and to present those for review and approval becomes really critical. And it's the difference of doing it in a month or so or taking a year to do that functionality. So a very robust data management system is critical to be able to respond to these diverging regulatory requirements that all of our jurisdictions are placing upon us.
Yes, Artie, thank you so much for your time and insights. Our next speaker is Terry Reid from Symmetric Health Solutions. Terry, I was just hoping you could give the audience a little more information about your background.
Sure, thanks, Mike. Good day. I am Terry Reid, Director of Partner Relations with Symmetric Health Solutions. I've known Pete and Artie for many years. I'm pleased to be on the panel with them. I have been involved with unique device identification since June 2006. I just figured that out this morning. 15 years. From 2010 to 2014, I was the Director of Informatics at FDA's CDRH and led the UDI program team. In 2015, I took the position of FDA's Senior Advisor for UDI Adoption in Electronic Health Information and stayed in that position until September 2019 when I left FDA. During my last year at FDA, I was the senior FDA member to the IMDRF UDI Application Guide Work Group. In June 2020, I joined Symmetric Health Solutions. My intent here today is to share some of my insights on global harmonization based upon the journey I've taken from guiding the rollout of the UDI from a regulatory and informatics perspective to now actively participating in implementing UDI and data from GoodID and other public sources into healthcare supply chain and clinical care IT systems. I hope I also reflect some of the viewpoints of those I've collaborated with over the past 15 years who continue to work with both in the US and abroad on improving how the UDI system works to advance patient safety. I hope some of them are on the call today and ask good questions and provide comments in the chat. I'm a big believer in understanding requirements for a program before implementing. I also believe in reviewing a program after implementation. Speaking plainly about its challenges and successes and using feedback from users to support continuous quality improvement. In the case of the UDI system, I can speak as a regulator, health system advocate, and vendor, not necessarily in that order. What do I see as requirements that have contributed to UDI? IMDRF has been mentioned by both Pete and Artie as important for setting the initial global UDI requirements. The IMDRF work on UDI, I think, was remarkable in that the goal was to start off with a harmonized system based upon data standards agreed upon by jurisdictions upfront before any regulations or databases were built. The notion was to harmonize first, not afterward, to use the IMDRF UDI guidance as jurisdictions rolled out their systems. We also had an information science focus, understanding that the UDI system had to be usable, not only to manufacturers and FDA, but to end users in order to be adopted. At FDA, we were intent to work towards the reason we were creating the system in the first place, ensure that UDI could help integrate FDA internal databases. But we also wanted UDI in the healthcare supply chain and clinical records as part of what we call real-world data that would be used to create real-world evidence for our own FDA regulatory decision-making. One thing we also realized was that FDA alone couldn't possibly answer all the questions coming from this new unique identifier. We couldn't understand all the domains that it would be used in and so we understood the importance of public-private partnerships. One of those examples is something called the ARM Learning UDI Community that was developed by the American Hospital Association. But we also participated in insights from issuing agencies like GS1, HIBIC, IBV, CCA, and the communities associated with those agencies. We knew that the test of the UDI system finally was not in populating Access Good ID or seeing UDIs on the label, but road testing and improving the system as it went along. Now, if we switch to the other side of the slide, I'm part of the vendor community now, using the UDI data and continuing to advocate as I can for general UDI adoption. But now I'm participating as a vendor in public-private partnerships. One of the things that I really didn't appreciate as a regulatory person was UDI and supply chain. We focused a lot with our Office of National Coordinator for Health IT on electronic health records and clinical data and medical device registries. But given that UDI is a data standard and is meant to flow throughout the life cycle of the device, it totally makes sense that the priority should be to get the UDI into the healthcare supply chain so that it can flow through that system. Another thing that I think is really important in my role as a vendor and an advocate is to make clear the data gaps that are preventing health IT systems and healthcare systems from using UDI effectively. And really important, the feedback loops that are required for success. In all my roles, the message is that UDI, like many other regulatory programs, should not be about checking a box of minimally complying with a regulation. Manufacturers and regulators should go beyond compliance to achieve the goals of public health. From my view, there continue to be these system challenges that go beyond data management concerns and need to be talked about openly and recognized so they can be addressed. One of these is that everyone seems to be looking to the regulator as the exclusive UDI system owner. As I mentioned earlier, FDA recognized this early on, and we recognized our limitations in trying to address and developed and worked with communities, public-private partnerships, and FDA continues to do that today in many arenas. A related concern is that even though we live in a global economy, jurisdictions are still embracing a local economy mindset when it comes to UDI. This doesn't recognize the fact that every variation from the original IMDRF principles or data has a significant impact on the end user, and that the end user may not even be located in their jurisdiction. FDA's Good ID is being used around the world today. US and non-US users now number in the thousands, maybe tens of thousands if you count all the vendors, manufacturers, and others using UDI. They know the gaps and challenges, but their voices aren't being collectively heard and fed back to the regulators and manufacturers in a systematic way to improve the data. And so even with the availability of Good ID, users in the US still don't rely on it exclusively for core device data. In addition, estimates from Symmetric experience shows that labels are scannable only about 45% of the time, and that the feedback loops there are inadequate for improving that situation. The last bullet may need a little explanation. We went through this last year, don't have to tell anyone on the call, some global supply chain upheavals as part of the many challenges of the pandemic. Certainly not all of the issues were related to lack of transparency of the supply chain, the inability to authenticate vendors, etc. There seems to be a lack of recognition that UDI has helped those who are relying on it to respond more effectively to COVID-19 supply chain concerns. Maybe not as effectively as if all Class 1 products in the US had UDIs, but more effectively than not using UDI at all. Recognizing that UDI should have helped and will help improve the efficiency of supply chain and data flowing to clinical care systems is an important message. Despite challenges, I think achieving the full benefits of the UDI system is still possible, especially now as an IT vendor. And the pandemic has raised awareness of the importance of supply chain for healthcare, something many of us, maybe on this call, have known for decades. I've listed on this slide some of the key points on my wish list for regulators and manufacturers who bear the most responsibility for creating the UDI infrastructure. For regulators, even if there are slight differences in regulations, please ensure that all regulatory UDI databases are publicly available and accessible in multiple ways. FDA has done this to the benefit of those trying to use the data for multiple purposes. I bolded, well, the next point is to actively seek feedback from data users. Collectively, I believe we should figure out a way to improve the process of making that feedback as transparent as the public data made available by regulators, and using that public feedback to make change to the original data supplied by the manufacturers. Reducing variability. A big offender, besides regulation, is how many device identifiers are being generated for what a hospital considers the same product. That's just one example. So we should standardize the UDI data now and not map it later. I took this picture in Wilmington, North Carolina. I'm attracted to the straight lines against a chaotic surface, the ocean. Variance between medical device regulations in different jurisdictions and between manufacturer implementations complicates efforts to create the originally envisioned global UDI system. I believe regulators and manufacturers in the evolving UDI system would benefit by recommitting to the original IMDRF guidances and more effectively engaging health systems in the regulatory process. People are relying on UDI data. Uncontrolled variation is the enemy of quality, not only in manufacturing, that focus of much of Deming's work, but in data quality in the Good ID system. Thanks.
Hey, thank you, Terry, Artie, and Pete for your time and insights today. We're going to move forward with the questions and comments. If you do have questions or comments for our panel, you can still send those via the Q&A option that should be located at the bottom of the webinar application. To start, we'll continue the conversation here with Terry. The first question is, why is it so important to stay true to the vision of one global UDI system versus requiring UDIs as a global identifier, but implemented slightly differently in each jurisdiction?
Thanks for the question, Mike. I've touched on this a little bit, but IMDRF and regulatory agencies like FDA had a reason for imposing two components to the UDI system, not one. The two components are manufacturers must create a UDI and put it on the label, but they must also submit key information about the device, and that information is intended to be public for use by any patients, vendors, clinicians, or anyone else that obtains use or provides value. Only having UDI as an identifier on the label simply does not achieve the goals of the global UDI system, being able to scan a medical device anywhere in the world and return standard information about that item, not different information depending on where it's scanned. A non-harmonized system is, in my opinion, not significantly better in increasing transparency of the supply chain or improving patient systems than what existed prior to UDI. Scan a label with an identifier and pull back data that is different depending on where it's received. Variation like this makes it difficult to ensure the identity of the device, track items across the country, compare outcomes, improve recall management, et cetera, et cetera. I'll stop.
Great. Thank you, Terry. This next question is for Pete. Pete, what would you say are the biggest challenges manufacturers encounter implementing UDI regulatory requirements?
Thank you, Mike. I think there are a couple of answers to that question. The one that comes to mind most readily is data quality, data quality, data quality. I said earlier, that figuring out which barcode to put your G10 in and the other application identifier sometimes requires some work, and it does. But what we have seen are the biggest challenges are in gathering the master data, putting it in the right format that the regulator requires, and then ensuring data quality. You might be surprised that even some of the check digits in G10s can be wrong when registering in the good ID. Are you using the right company prefix? And then the rest of the record, there are approximately 60 some fields in the UDI, in the FDA good ID database. And so do you have the proper verification, data quality validation rules and verification rules built in? What are the data requirements of the database? And as I said earlier, if you're using a technology company as a partner to register data, then bring them into the internal discussion. They can help you. They can help you quite a bit in understanding how to apply proper data quality techniques to ensure the data is fit for the intended purpose. And then you're not going to end up registering data that's incorrect, and they haven't then to go back to the process of how do you correct that in a live database. So I would say to me that that probably is the biggest challenge that we've heard from manufacturers.
Interesting. Thanks, Pete. And I'll open this one up to anyone on the panel interested in answering this. I think it goes along with the last question, and that is when you're trying to implement UDI regulatory requirements, what is the time frame for that? How long does that typically take if they have nothing in place initially?
I'll start. That is a really interesting question. I guess the short answer is a long time, but right? I remember in the early days when the FDA UDI regulation came online and the good ID database was made live, and we talked to manufacturers that have been already working for literally years ahead of that. It really depends on a couple of things. I think for the manufacturers that have been barcoding their product, that have been putting in our world, G10s on their products, either for a retail pharmacy level or at a regulated healthcare hospital use, it's a little easier for them because they have already been down that journey, But if you haven't been, and then you have to start from scratch, what I would say out of the gate is partner with someone, a solution provider, a technology company, somebody that can help you create a roadmap to get you from where you are to where you need to be. And because you're going to need help if you don't have that knowledge internally. And so for a larger company, the knowledge may be there, although larger companies have challenges too, because it's multi-divisions and a lot of people, and you have to coalesce all of that. But for the smaller companies, the knowledge may not be there beyond, from a data preparation perspective and barcoding. So, partner with someone that can help you. That would be at least my take on that. Not sure what the other panelists think.
I would echo what Pete just said. I think from our perspective, I would divide it into two categories. One is the knowledge of what you need to do, and then the second is the capability to do what you need to do. I think technology can assist in enforcing regulatory compliance. It can assist with moving data around, etc. But having the intelligence within the organization of what needs to be done is also a critical factor, and in my mind, one of the harder ones to do.
Yeah, I agree with that. I didn't mention this in my talk. I don't think any of us have really mentioned it, but the importance of the label also, and so much attention in companies is placed on the label. And I believe that barring the data management problems, which of course Artie and Pete have both pointed those out, but a recognition by companies that looking at that label and ensuring that the data on the label matches up with the data that's submitted to the regulatory databases and the intent, that somebody's actually going to look at that label and scan the label. And once that information on the label to go into their system could help with simplifying this a little bit. I know there was a lot, in the initial days, there was lots of consternation. What do I put in the UDI database? And a lot of wringing of hands. So that's one thing we haven't talked about is standardizing the label.
Yeah, and I think that ties in really well with comments that Trent is making in terms of recall and UDI and labels, etc. I think there is a huge link with the label in order to be able to do recalls. And as you all know, you want to make your recalls as focused as possible, throwing the smallest net possible. So in order to tie that together with a batch information, the product, the PI on the label is where it ties in together. So the UDI, as you know, is a combination of the DI and the PI. And I would imagine recalls are almost always at the PI level because of some manufacturing issue or some labeling issue. So the labeling system utilizing the primary DI and the manufacturing information is critical in performing any recalls.
Right. And just to link to that, I mentioned the public-private partnerships, the ARM Learning UDI community. I even think Pete may have been involved with some of these work groups. Recalls is a topic in that Learning UDI community, and the lack of the device identifiers appearing in a recall submission. And even if they appear in a recall submission from the manufacturer, they're not getting exposed in the recall database at FDA. And so those who are scanning UDI in a hospital who would love to have that connection between the device identifier of UDI and the recall data are not able to rely on that now. And if I'm interpreting Trent's question, it's kind of like, why is that difficult for a manufacturer, or is it not? And I guess we can't really have an open dialogue about it, but it's a question to think about as manufacturers are submitting data to Good ID, that they're also submitting recalls, and that data should also match, like you're saying, Pete. I mean, Artie, sorry.
Indeed, if you've been around for a long time like I have, and you remember back in the 80s, and if you were involved with in the retail industry or in the apparel industry, you may recall a term that people use called slap and ship, which basically meant that retailers were requiring their manufacturers, the apparel manufacturers, to comply with certain labeling and barcoding requirements. And in some cases, all people did was just put a barcode on it and ship it, and that was it. But when you listen to the work that Terry's doing now, I really like that, because it really putting a UDI on a device, whether it's the device itself or the pack that it came in, it's really all about the point of use. And that's really what they're driving at. And so when you get to the point that you can use that barcode to scan it for a recall, to scan it at the point of use. And if you look at hospital applications, and one of the things that we're focused on now is, we, from a GS1 perspective, all over the world over the last few years, has been greater emphasis on helping the hospitals at the local level through our member organizations. Manufacturers have done a tremendous job over the last 10, 15 years in barcoding their product lines. I remember when I got involved in this back in 2007, Dennis Black and others that are on the call will remember this. And it was a discovery part for a lot of companies. But the fact that they made so much progress, and the fact that those barcodes are there, and to the degree that they can be used, not just at the point of receive at the back door of the hospital to put in inventory, but also in the pharmacy and the pathways and point of care scanning, to the point that you can use that in an operating theater, is really what we're all after. So the point about the recall, to me, brings to mind all of these things that are so important once a barcode is on that product. And so to me, the journey with UDI is just begun from the terms of utilization perspective.
Yeah. And the importance of that feedback, you know, that I talked about. Yeah. Sorry.
So I think what we're finding, and we saw that with the FDA's implementation in terms of whether it becomes an edict or a recommendation or a suggestion, more and more we are seeing that regulatory organizations are pushing industry towards barcode verification at point of labeling because of this problem. So, and I think Saudi Arabia just enacted something in terms of scanning and following your issuing agency's rules around scannability. So GS1's, I believe, Pete, you could tutor me in this, of course, but is C or better,
right?
In terms of a barcode scan. And a lot of companies at the beginning of time were satisfied with a time of label design to print out a sample and put it on the verifier and grader, and if they got a C, then it was done. That's no longer the case. I think what we're seeing is scannability testing as a sample during the manufacturing process, and also many people kind of tiptoeing around 100% vision inspection of the labels. And that's an area that I think will see greater growth as more and more bite is put into the enforcement of barcode scannability.
Yeah, I wanted to address a couple people have asked about the 45%. That I almost didn't put it on the slides, but I wanted to put a stake in the ground because that number is really hard to identify. I was taking it from, you know, Symmetric's experience with 280 hospitals that we serve. It's certainly not a, you know, an industry-wide survey or scan-a-thon that's been done. But we're certainly not at 100%, and there's a lot of things we're seeing that, you know, like embedding HIBIC codes into GS1 barcodes and all kinds of things. So not only the, you know, the verification, but just getting the basics correct, which takes feedback again from those who are trying to scan and getting that feedback to the manufacturers and having something done about it.
Okay, great. Another question we received is just what is the most effective structure to use to get all departments and divisions to align their transformation? I think this question was asked toward Artie.
Great question. Thank you. I kind of touched upon it a little bit at the beginning of my presentation. It's the whole concept of only allowing one group or one system to update each data element. What we're seeing a lot is either master data management systems where certain tabs are secured to certain departments, and there is a workflow that each department goes in and updates their data for which they're responsible. Alternatively, we've seen input forms where various departments during the new product implementation or other activity, they fill in this form, which may be in Excel, maybe some workflow capabilities. And then all of that goes to a master data management group that is responsible for updating everything. And lastly, really, the ability to move data within the organization so that that single source of entry takes the data and populates all of the different systems that use it is critical. I think if there's one standard statement don't allow the same data to be updated in more than one place, because then you're almost guaranteed that it's going to get out of sync.
I cannot agree with that more. I think, when we talk about master data management and governance, you start with the policies and then the roles and responsibilities. And it's not just at a personal level. It's sometimes at a department level if you're a very large company. But whatever it is, whether it's at an individual level or a department level, absolutely what Aria said, I cannot agree with you more. It's if the data exists in multiple locations, and in an ERP as a product is being produced, and you may get some data from your raw material providers, and you incorporate that into your internal system. Make sure there's one final place where the data is stored right before you publish it externally to anyone outside your organization, whether it's a trading partner, hospital, distributor that you're selling to, or UDI database. And in that place, there has to be someone. You're probably familiar with the RACI style of roles, responsibilities: responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. Somebody's got to be responsible with the organization for signing off and saying, "Yep, this is good. This is good to go. It's fit for the intended purpose." Because if you don't do that, then what Ari said will happen is you will end up with incomplete data, and that's what causes the biggest problem in sharing master data. We've learned that with GDSN over the past 15, 17 years, is that whenever you start automating the sharing of data, it's like putting a big magnifying glass on the sins of the past, is the way I call it, because you start codifying rules and procedures. And when you do that, then you're more likely will come across something that was not the way that it should be, and that's the opportunity to get it right.
And to add to that, the hospitals are relying on that one source of data, like I was talking about. And what's interesting to me is the parallel universe in the hospital. They have the ERP systems also, and they have sources of truth also. And it's kind of like, at some point, we have to recognize we're all in this together, and that the customers of the manufacturers are relying on them for the source data, and the customers at the hospitals are relying on that source data too.
Okay, great. Thank you guys for that. We do have a couple more questions, but I did put up the panelists' contact information. If you have additional questions or we don't get to your questions, there are obviously their contact information. One question I wanted to get to was just this commenter said that they heard that there was some FDA exemptions given during the pandemic. Are you aware of those and what exactly they were?
I am not aware of those.
Well, the emergency use authorizations did not require, if you received one of those for a product, it didn't require UDI to be part of it.
From the vaccine perspective.
Well, for devices that
Gotcha.
exclusively received emergency use authorization. If you need it, if you had to have a 510K, obviously you would require UDI, but if that was not required, then the UDI was not required.
Mike, if I could address a question that Brad Stager is asking in the chat. Do we have time for that? May I?
Yeah.
Great. So the way that we've solved the problem, the problem as stated is there are GTIN triggers, and for the same product, the GTIN may change because of that trigger. But many systems can only house one GTIN for each item, like ERP systems, etc. So the issue becomes, how do we maintain the relationship between a product batch that was manufactured 6 months ago and its GTIN versus having only one place to do it? And the way that we've solved that for some of our colleagues is to have a batch history table. And the batch history table is keyed by product number, batch number, and then it has some data elements, including GTIN, including whether it's MDD, Medical Device Directive, or Medical Device Regulations in Europe. So that batch history captures and keeps the information that may change later, but it retains the historical information for that item batch combination?
That's a great answer, Artie. I saw that question. Glad you picked it up. Halfway through 2020, we republished an updated set of the GS1 Healthcare GTN location rules, and they're more expansive with a lot more examples to fit very unique situations like that. And one of the ongoing discussions we had through the update of that entire document is that the an issuing agency's rules and GS1 rules for assigning GTINs are not written for a particular regulation, but they have to we have to make sure that they have applicability across a broad range of scenarios, and they cannot provide a counter direction to what the regulation is. So they're usually a little more general, but then you get into exactly what Artie is saying about how to manage that internally. And that I'd be interested in hearing more from you, Brad, if you want to discuss that offline, because it looks like you're wrestling with something there that looks pretty interesting to understand. So thank you, Artie, for picking that up.
Sure.
Okay, great. Well, I want to thank again our panelists today, Artie, Terry, and Pete, for their time and insights today. Once again, their contact information is up on the screen. I'd also like to thank the audience for their active participation today. A recording will be available in the coming weeks, so look out for that. I will be sending an email when it is available. So thanks again, everyone, for your time, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you again for the opportunity to be part of this. I appreciate it.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.